If you have your own creepy story, I'm waiting for your email. All the information under the video. Thank you for watching. Please press like and subscribe to my channel. Story 1. I can still remember the way my heart pounded as I sprinted through the inky blackness of the forest that night. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness, every shadow a potential threat. It all began when I decided to go for a run one fateful evening, and I had no idea it would lead to a horrifying ordeal that still haunts my nightmares. My name is Sarah, and I was an avid runner. I loved the thrill of the night run, the way the cool air kissed my skin, and the solitude that enveloped me. The trail near my house was a familiar one, winding through a dense forest, with only the moonlight to guide me. That night, the moon was a mere sliver in the sky, casting eerie silhouettes of the trees around me. But I was confident in my ability to navigate the path. As I set off, the rhythmic beat of my footsteps matched the rhythm of my pounding heart. The night was quiet, and the solitude was a welcome escape from the busyness of my life. I pushed myself harder, determined to get a good workout. Little did I know that this night's run would push my limits in ways I could never have imagined. After about a mile into my run, a rustling sound in the bushes to my right made me slow down. I had often encountered small creatures on my runs, but this sound was different. It was as though something larger, something much more ominous, was lurking in the underbrush. I stopped and peered into the darkness, trying to make out any movement, but there was nothing, just an unsettling silence. I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me, and I continued my run. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rustling grew more persistent, following me as I ran. It was as if someone or something was deliberately keeping pace with me. I picked up my speed, determined to put distance between me and whatever was out there. But the feeling of being pursued only intensified. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to the limit. I knew I couldn't keep up this pace for long, but I also couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my gut. What was following me in the darkness? I decided to make a sudden turn, veering off the main trail onto a narrower path. The rustling sounds grew fainter, and I thought I might have lost whatever was tracking me. I stopped to catch my breath, my heart still racing. That's when I heard it, a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. I turned around slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sight that greeted me was like something out of a nightmare. In the pale glow of my flashlight, I saw a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting back at me from the underbrush. They were a sickly shade of yellow, and they belonged to a massive, hulking figure that was lurking just beyond the reach of my light. Fear washed over me in a cold, paralyzing wave. I couldn't make out the details of the creature, but its presence was unmistakable. It stood there unmoving, its growl growing deeper and more menacing. My heart raced, and my mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. With trembling hands, I shone the flashlight directly at the creature, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of its grotesque form. It was a creature straight out of a nightmare, with matted fur, sharp claws, and a twisted feral face. It was a creature I had heard about only in legends, a rogue werewolf. I had heard stories about the existence of these mythical creatures, but I had always dismissed them as pure fantasy. Yet here I was, face to face with a creature that defied explanation. The beast's growl grew more menacing, and it took a menacing step forward, its yellow eyes never leaving mine. Panic gripped me, and my survival instincts kicked in. I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps behind me, and the sound of its growls echoed through the forest. The adrenaline coursing through my veins gave me newfound strength, and I pushed myself to run faster than I ever had before. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming a blur of darkness. I couldn't see where I was going, but I couldn't afford to slow down. The fear of being caught by the werewolf kept me going, pushing me to my limits. I didn't know how long I had been running, but the forest suddenly opened up into a small clearing. I didn't dare look back to see if the creature was still pursuing me. Gasping for breath, I realized that I had reached a dead end. Before me lay a steep, rocky hillside, and there was no way to go but up. With no other option, I started to climb, using my hands and feet to scramble up the treacherous slope. The rocks were sharp and unforgiving, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting away from the creature that pursued me. As I climbed higher, I heard the sounds of the creature approaching the base of the hill. It let out a blood-curdling howl that sent chills down my spine. I knew I had to keep going, keep climbing, and hope that the hill would give me a temporary advantage. Finally, I reached the top, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. My muscles ached, and my body was covered in scratches and bruises from the climb. But I didn't have time to rest. I could hear the creature snarling and growling below, and it was clear that it was not giving up. Desperation gave me renewed strength, and I pushed myself to my feet. I could see a faint glow of lights in the distance, and I realized that I had reached the outskirts of the forest. I stumbled in that direction, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. As I emerged from the forest, I found myself on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The streetlights cast a comforting glow, and the houses felt like a sanctuary. I pounded on the door of the nearest house, praying that someone would answer. A woman opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of me, disheveled and covered in dirt and sweat. I barely had the breath to explain my situation, but the fear in my eyes must have conveyed enough. She quickly pulled me inside and locked the door. It wasn't long before the police arrived, and I recounted my terrifying ordeal to them. They searched the forest, but found no trace of the werewolf. They assured me that they would continue to investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had simply vanished into the night. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about my encounter with the rogue werewolf. I had survived, but the memory of those glowing yellow eyes and the snarling, monstrous form haunted my nightmares. I couldn't go back to my beloved night runs, not after what I had experienced. I started researching the legends of werewolves, hoping to find some answers about the creature that had chased me. I discovered that these mythical creatures were often believed to be shapeshifters, humans who could transform into wolves or wolf-like creatures under the light of the full moon. Their existence had been the subject of countless stories and myths for centuries, but many considered them nothing more than folklore. However, as I delved deeper into my research, I came across a small but dedicated group of individuals who claimed to have encountered these creatures in the real world. Their stories were chilling and eerily similar to my own experience. They spoke of encounters in the dead of night, in remote areas, and in the presence of a full moon. The more I read, the more convinced I became that the creature I had encountered was indeed a rogue werewolf. These stories spoke of their insatiable hunger for flesh and their relentless pursuit of prey. I realized that I had been incredibly lucky to escape with my life. I couldn't keep my experience a secret, and I began sharing my story with others who had encountered these creatures. We formed a small support group, finding comfort in the fact that we weren't alone in our encounters. But the more we shared, the more we realized that the rogue werewolves were becoming bolder and more aggressive. They were no longer confined to remote areas. They were creeping closer to populated areas. The authorities were largely dismissive of our stories, and the general public continued to regard our experiences as delusions or tall tales. The rogue werewolves operated in the shadows, and it seemed that they could remain hidden from the world. One evening, as my fellow survivors and I were gathered for a support group meeting, we received an anonymous tip about a possible rogue werewolf sighting in a nearby forest. The informant had heard our stories and believed that we were the only ones who might take the threat seriously. Without hesitation, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, weapons, and a burning determination to uncover the truth, we headed into the forest that had become synonymous with my own horrifying encounter. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, and an eerie silence hung in the air. We moved cautiously through the trees, our senses on high alert. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever horror might emerge from the shadows. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the same unsettling feeling of being watched settled over us. Branches rustled, and we could hear the faint sound of growling in the distance. It was as though the rogue werewolf was aware of our presence and was toying with us. leading us deeper into the darkness. Suddenly we stumbled upon a clearing, and there, in the dim light of our flashlights, we saw it, a monstrous wolf-like creature, its fur matted and its eyes a malevolent yellow. It was the same creature that had pursued me that fateful night, and there was no mistaking it. The rogue werewolf had returned. We froze in terror as the creature advanced, its growls growing more menacing. But this time, we were prepared. We raised our weapons and aimed our flashlights directly at the creature. It hesitated, its eyes squinting against the light, and then it let out a blood-curdling howl. The battle that ensued was a blur of chaos and terror. The rogue werewolf was fast and ferocious, its claws and fangs bared, and it attacked with a savage, primal fury. We fought back, firing our weapons and doing our best to stay out of its reach. The forest echoed with the sound of gunshots and the snarls of the creature. Despite our determination, the rogue werewolf was a formidable adversary. It seemed almost impervious to our attacks, its wounds healing almost as fast as we could inflict them. It became clear that we were outmatched, and the tide of the battle began to turn against us. In the midst of the chaos, I could see the faces of my fellow survivors, filled with fear and determination. We had come together to face the nightmare that had haunted our lives, and we were determined to stand our ground. But the odds were stacked against us, and the rogue werewolf seemed relentless in its pursuit of us. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the distant sound of sirens pierced the night. The flashing blue and red lights of police cars drew closer, and the creature let out a final, frustrated howl before disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived just in time to find us, battered and bruised, but alive. We recounted our harrowing battle with the rogue werewolf, but the officers remained skeptical, believing that our encounter had been with a dangerous wild animal. Despite their doubts, they searched the area, and to our surprise, they discovered traces of the creature's blood and fur. It was undeniable proof that the rogue werewolf was real, not just a product of our imaginations. As the authorities took over the investigation, my fellow survivors and I were left with a mix of relief and lingering fear. The rogue werewolf had not been captured, and we knew that it would continue to pose a threat to anyone who ventured into the night. Our experiences had forever changed us, and we couldn't ignore the fact that the world held secrets far more terrifying than we had ever imagined. We had faced the stuff of nightmares and survived, but the memory of those glowing yellow eyes and the snarling, monstrous form would continue to haunt our nightmares. The rogue werewolf remained at large, lurking in the shadows, a terrifying reminder that the line between myth and reality was not always as clear as we would like to believe. And as the moon rose in the night sky, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked in the darkness, waiting to be discovered by those who dared to venture into the night. Story 2. The air was crisp as I laced up my running shoes. It was a beautiful starlit night, the kind of evening that made running an absolute joy. I'd always preferred running after dark. The cool, quiet streets, the solitude, it was therapeutic. But that night would be different. I was about to experience something that would change the way I felt about those peaceful nocturnal runs forever. I started my run with a familiar route, the streets illuminated only by the soft glow of streetlights. My breathing was steady, and my pace was strong. I loved the feeling of my body pushing itself, almost as if it had a life of its own. As I turned the corner onto Elm Street, a spine-tingling sensation coursed through me. A flicker of unease washed over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shrugging off the paranoia, I continued my run, turning into the dense, dark forest path that I'd taken a dozen times before. It was a risky choice, but I felt adventurous, craving a change from the usual suburban streets. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the shadows grew thicker. The only source of light was the faint moonlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees overhead. My footfalls echoed eerily in the silence of the forest. I kept my pace, my breath visible in the cold night air. My unease was growing with every step. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was just behind me, a feeling of dread that something unnatural was lurking in the woods. The sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs only intensified my fear. My heart pounded as I considered turning back, but I didn't want to admit defeat to an overactive imagination. Just when I thought my paranoia had gotten the best of me, I saw a strange figure up ahead. It was tall, gaunt, and shrouded in darkness, almost like a silhouette. The figure seemed to be swaying, as if suspended from a tree. Panic surged through my veins, and I skidded to a halt. "What the hell?" I muttered, my breaths coming in rapid bursts. The figure seemed to be hanging from a tree, but something about it was just wrong. As I strained my eyes to see more clearly, I realized that it wasn't hanging. It was levitating. It was a sight that defied all logic and reason. Before I could react, the figure turned, its face obscured in the shadows. I was paralyzed with fear as it glided toward me, its movements unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. I had no choice but to turn and run, the adrenaline surging through my body. I could hear the eerie sound of laughter echoing through the forest, a haunting, guttural chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. The presence was right behind me, and I could feel its cold, lifeless breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the forest and back onto the suburban streets, gasping for breath. I couldn't see the figure anymore, but the sense of dread still clung to me. I knew I couldn't stop running, not until I was safely home. As I continued to run through the dimly lit streets, I thought back to the legend my friends had shared with me. It was said that these woods were haunted, that a malevolent spirit had taken residence there. I had always dismissed it as a mere tale to spook people, but what I had just witnessed felt too real to ignore. Doubt gnawed at me. I wondered if I had stumbled upon some malevolent entity, a restless spirit that had somehow crossed over from the realm of the dead. It seemed absurd, but what other explanation could there be for what I had seen? With each passing step, I felt as if the presence was still following me, a sinister force lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pushed myself to run faster, desperate to escape. I reached my neighborhood, the familiar houses providing a semblance of safety. But as I ran past a dimly lit house, something else caught my eye. A face appeared in the window, a pale, twisted visage staring out at me with hollow eyes. It was the same figure I had seen in the woods, and it was now inside the house. My body went into overdrive, and I sprinted toward my home, my legs burning with exertion. I could hear the sound of the figure's laughter echoing in my ears, growing louder and more malevolent with each step. Finally, I reached my front door and fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling with fear. I burst inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. It was over, or so I thought. As I tried to calm my racing heart, I heard a soft, eerie whisper coming from the hallway. The voice was low and full of malice, like the rustling of dry leaves on a cold night. "Come out and play," it hissed, sending a chill down my spine. I turned to see the figure standing in the dimly lit hallway. Its presence filled the air with a suffocating malevolence. There was no escape. It had followed me home. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted up the stairs, not looking back. The laughter of the figure echoed through the house, growing louder and more sinister with each step. I slammed the door to my bedroom and locked it, my chest heaving and my mind racing for a way out. There was a sudden deafening crash as the figure slammed against the door, its inhuman strength shaking the very foundations of the house. I knew I couldn't stay in the room. I had to find a way to escape. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help me. My window. It was my only chance. I rushed to it, throwing it open, and looked down at the ground 2 stories below. It was a risky jump, but it was my only hope. The figure continued to pound on the door, and I knew I had no other choice. With a deep breath, I leaped out of the window, falling through the cold night air. I hit the ground with a jarring thud, but managed to push through the pain and scramble to my feet. I ran, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached a nearby gas station, where I called the police. I told them about the figure, the haunting laughter, and the sinister presence that had chased me. They arrived at my house and searched it, but they found nothing. The officers questioned me, clearly skeptical of my story. They suggested that I might have been suffering from exhaustion or hallucinations brought on by the stress of my late-night run. But I knew what I had seen was real. I could still feel the malevolence of that figure, the presence that had pursued me. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. I became obsessed with the idea of uncovering the truth behind the malevolent presence that had haunted me that night. I delved into local history and legends, searching for any clues that might explain the figure I had encountered. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. There were numerous stories about the haunted woods and the malevolent spirit that was said to inhabit them. According to the local lore, the spirit was that of a man named Samuel Hawthorne, who had lived in the area centuries ago. He had been accused of practicing dark magic and was condemned to death by hanging. His body was left to rot in the same woods where I had seen the figure. It was said that his vengeful spirit still lingered there, seeking to torment and harm anyone who dared to enter his domain. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Samuel Hawthorne's spirit was the entity I had encountered. It was as if he had been waiting for someone like me to cross his path, someone who would be lured into his malevolent trap. I couldn't let this go. I had to find a way to confront the spirit and put an end to its reign of terror. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the supernatural and unexplained. He agreed to meet me at the haunted woods, and together, we would try to uncover the truth and confront the malevolent spirit. The night we chose for our expedition was a moonless one, the kind of night that would make any rational person hesitate to enter those eerie woods. Armed with flashlights and a bag of protective charms the historian had brought, we ventured into the darkness. The woods were just as foreboding as I remembered, the dense canopy of trees blotting out the night sky. We moved slowly and cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the inky darkness. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and the atmosphere became oppressive. It was as if the very trees themselves were trying to keep us out. My heart raced as we approached the spot where I had first encountered the malevolent presence. The historian began reciting an incantation, a prayer for protection. I clutched one of the protective charms tightly in my hand, trying to banish the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. It was then that I heard it, the same eerie laughter that had haunted my nightmares. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees, and the temperature dropped even further. We turned to see the figure, Samuel Hawthorne, emerging from the darkness. He was even more grotesque and terrifying than I remembered, his eyes empty sockets, his face twisted in a malevolent grin. The historian continued to recite his incantation, the words carrying a desperate edge. I raised the protective charm, hoping it would ward off the vengeful spirit. But Samuel Hawthorne was undeterred. He floated closer, his laughter growing more deranged. It was then that the historian produced a small vial filled with a shimmering liquid. He tossed it toward Samuel Hawthorne, and the vengeful spirit recoiled as if struck by an unseen force. The liquid seemed to burn with an otherworldly fire, and Samuel Hawthorne let out a blood-curdling scream. The historian shouted for me to run, and I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted through the woods, the figure of Samuel Hawthorne hot on our heels. His agonized cries echoed through the night, but he couldn't breach the protective barrier the historian had created. We burst out of the woods, gasping for breath, the adrenaline surging through our veins. Samuel Hawthorne was trapped within the woods, unable to escape. The historian explained that the shimmering liquid was a concoction of blessed water and salt, a powerful barrier against malevolent spirits. As we caught our breath, I felt a profound sense of relief. We had confronted the malevolent spirit and, for the time being, had contained its vengeful presence. It was a small victory, but it brought closure to the nightmarish encounter I had experienced. Over the following weeks, I kept a close watch on the haunted woods. There were no more reports of strange figures or eerie laughter. It seemed that Samuel Hawthorne had been driven back into the depths of the forest, where he belonged. Though the experience had been harrowing, it had also opened my eyes to the world of the supernatural. I had witnessed something that defied all rational explanation, and it had changed my perspective on the unknown. As for my nightly runs, I couldn't bring myself to return to those woods. I stuck to well-lit streets and open areas, and I always carried a protective charm with me, a small reminder of the malevolent presence I had encountered. The memory of that night still haunted me, but it also served as a reminder that there were forces in the world beyond our understanding, and that some mysteries were better left unexplored. Samuel Hawthorne had been driven back, but I knew that the darkness of those woods still held secrets that might never be revealed. I had survived the midnight marathon, and in doing so, had come face to face with the supernatural. It was a night I would never forget, a night that would forever change the way I looked at the world after dark. Story 3. In the small town of Marblehead, Massachusetts, a local runner named Mark had a routine of running along the winding streets and picturesque coastline every evening. He was a dedicated athlete and loved the feeling of solitude as he pounded the pavement after sunset. One evening, as Mark began his run along the coastal path, he noticed a strange, unsettling presence. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a figure running a short distance behind him. It wasn't unusual for others to be out jogging, but what made this figure stand out was its appearance. The mysterious runner wore old-fashioned attire, vintage running gear from the 1950s. The person had a crew-cut hairstyle and a stoic expression, as if plucked from a bygone era. This alone would have been odd, but what truly disturbed Mark was the lack of modern details. No fitness tracker, no smartphone, not even running shoes. It was as if this person had stepped out of a time capsule. Mark increased his pace, attempting to put some distance between himself and the bizarre figure. But no matter how fast he ran, the mysterious runner kept up effortlessly. The stranger never appeared to tire or break a sweat, and the rhythmic sound of their footsteps echoed ominously. Mark's unease deepened, but he couldn't find a way to communicate with the enigmatic runner. Every attempt to strike up a conversation was met with silence, or a blank stare. It was as if the runner were entirely focused on the task at hand. The route took them through winding coastal trails, narrow paths, and deserted roads. Mark's dread grew, and he began to fear that he was stuck with this eerie companion. He couldn't abandon his run, nor could he find a logical explanation for the stranger's presence. As they reached a particularly remote part of the path, Mark decided to sprint away from the mysterious runner, hoping to lose them for good. He pushed his body to the limit, and for a moment, he managed to create some distance between them. But when he glanced back, his heart sank. The figure was gone. Relieved, Mark slowed his pace and continued his run alone, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He couldn't understand how the person had vanished so quickly. Had they decided to turn back? Had they been a mere hallucination? As Mark completed his run and returned to his home, he couldn't escape the eerie feeling that had taken hold of him. He shared his strange encounter with friends and neighbors, but no one could offer a reasonable explanation. The story of the mysterious running companion became a local legend, with some suggesting that Mark had crossed paths with a ghostly figure from the past, destined to relive their final run along the coastal path for eternity. To this day, the unsettling experience haunts Mark, and he still occasionally sees the phantom figure out of the corner of his eye when he runs at night. The mysterious running companion remains an enigma, a reminder that some mysteries are beyond explanation, and some encounters defy the rational realm.